Well, for many folks across the U.S., waking up early this week, feeling the Arctic chill, another shot of cold air has come down from Canada and the Arctic, and it's giving us extremely cold temperatures across much of the country. We got potential for some winter weather activity as well. We're going to talk about all that and more. Joining us now for a look at what is happening this week in the weather, Eric Snodgrass with Conduit Ag joins us. Eric, I'm bundled up in the Mid-South. I'm sure you're bundled up in Illinois, and I think many folks are wearing a few extra layers. It is extremely cold for many folks here to start off the week, Eric.
Yeah, I'm not looking for that next power bill because January's been cold for most of us east of the Rocky Mountains. I'm talking from the Rockies all the way to the East Coast. What's interesting about today, in my opinion, is two things. Okay, first of all, we have what we refer to as antecedent cold. Now, why is that important? If you get cold air locked into place across North America, especially in the midsection of the country, all the way down to the Gulf Coast, what it does is it takes a storm track and just keeps pushing it farther and farther to the south. In fact, this morning, this is kind of a neat bit of geography. There is a pocket, a very small spot down in Central America, the southern tip of Mexico, where we have this what was called the Tejano Pass. And there is this gap in the mountains where the winds will come out of the Gulf of Mexico into the Caribbean and go straight out into the Pacific. And sometimes they go 50, 60, 70 miles an hour. So if you can just imagine this, that's where we are. We're way down there in Central America. Well, every time this happens, we know that sets us up with this antecedent cold. You don't get that wind down there unless you've driven a front that far south. And what that's going to do is it's going to do two things. The first thing is set up a southerly storm track, which means we're going to have winter storm. We already have winter storm warnings from Texas all the way to the Florida coast. There's an ice problem in southern Georgia, northern Florida over the next 48 hours. And then we've got the risk of developing Santa Ana winds once again in California. So, I mean, we're going on now 2 weeks of this ongoing Santa Ana wind threat. Every week, it's just 2 to 3 days of it. And unfortunately, the red flag warnings are out. The high wind advisories and watches and warnings are out. And we're looking at just another 2 days, the Monday and Tuesday of this week, having extreme fire danger in the Southwest as they continue to try to contain the fires that started 2 weeks ago. For the rest of us, there's some new colors on some of my maps. These extreme cold warnings and whatnot that extend all the way from the northern plains across a broad section of the rest of the United States, where we're going to spend a few days this week trying to get our temperatures out of the single digits in some places and try to get them up above like -10 to -20 across the northern tier of the U.S. So, man, this is a highly, amplified week, and it follows a weekend that finally delivered some snow into the Northeast, and that's been a bit of a rare sight this particular winter, unless you've been under the lake effect snow belts. Outside of that, they've not had much in the Northeast. So my biggest concern with all of this, Jesse, if I could just get this all out in one breath here, is where is there not flow? So if I've got wind coming through the Tejano Pass, I've got Santa Ana winds in the coming off the San Gabriel Mountains. If you could picture this in your mind, those are winds that are starting from the north or northeast and going toward the southwest. That's the wrong direction. We live in the westerly wind belt. We should be seeing flow come across the country. And that's been a major issue with this winter. We've had a one-dimensional jet stream. It's just been the northern branch, and it's been highly variable. It's completely left the West Coast in the lurch now for a while. It's been very dry across the West, and it's not expected to continue to bring moisture there or in the Central Plains, Central United States anytime soon. So it's amazing to be talking about all of the action so far south in the United States, where they're going to pick up a few inches of snow and they're not prepared for it, or the ice that's going to be in Georgia and Florida. Again, something that is going to be devastating to agriculture in that area. What are we? We're tucked into brutally cold, dry air. And I'd like to see a return of Gulf moisture, a warm up. And I want to get these rivers turned back around and get the soil moisture up. And honestly, that is where this problem is going to remain stuck until we get something shifting in the Pacific. And you're like, well, what might that be? Maybe La Nina. I mean, La Nina is probably at peak. It's got to fade. But my goodness, Jesse, there are some issues this winter that have me concerned about where we end up in February, March, and April.
And I'm glad you mentioned that, because I do want to ask you a little bit about that setup here getting into the growing season. And it's something that I've noticed too here this winter so far that you kind of alluded to, is that we've had these winter events in places where we don't normally see snow and ice, yet
Yeah.
areas where we normally do, the precipitation that has moved through has been rather light, if any at all. So thinking about that and just looking ahead, I know drought's a concern for many folks getting into spring planting season.
Yeah, so here's my thoughts on this, okay? Where has the snow been? We've had two snowstorms lately. One that started, what was that, January 6th, 7th? That was one that shut down Kansas City, went all the way to Washington, D.C. Then we had a few days later, the one that came out of Dallas and went across Tennessee, Kentucky, and it gets over to, again, to the mid-Atlantic. And you talk to folks that live in that area, they're like, man, this winter's been unbelievable. Go north of there. Iowa, the rest of Nebraska, the Dakotas, Minnesota, Wisconsin. I mean, my daughter just spent this weekend at a church retreat skiing, and she showed us pictures the whole way driving up and there's no snow on the ground. There's more snow in Champaign than there was in Wisconsin. That's a hole. That's a hole where there's typically snow pack in winter. So you ask about these broader questions. Fall's drought is still lurking and the lack of soil moisture beneath all of that. And now we see all the dryness that's in the plains, in the southern plains, in the southwest, in Mexico. And you say, what about spring? If you ask me about spring, this is what I'm concerned about. I think that drought area grows in the plains. I think it's going to be wet in the Ohio Valley. I think it's going to be tight windows in the Ohio Valley, really wet. But then does the drought migrate from the west to the east? There's a lot of model evidence. There's a lot of historic evidence that those particular combinations of events could happen, putting some risk on the U.S. crop going into next year. And the big question I want to know, Jesse, and I was talking with Matt Bennett. I don't know if you know Matt. You probably know Matt Bennett.
Mm-hmm.
Matt and I were chatting last week, and he was getting grilled on U.S. acreage for corn next year. Because we know South America is going to have a huge bean crop. I know there's some problems with the quality. It's been too wet in the north as they harvested. And boy, Twitter loves to show you every terrible looking soybean down in Brazil. But overall, we know that the rest of that crop looks pretty darn good. So he's been getting asked questions. Are we going to have an absolutely massive corn crop this next year? And I'm saying, all right, what if we do? And we see drought pressures creeping in from the west, starting in spring, peaking in summer. And I think those are the big questions that we're going to talk about all winter. And until we have evidence to overturn that thought process, then that's the narrative. So I want that to be clear. Like, I'm just pointing out what I know now, knowing very, very well that the atmosphere could have something up its sleeve that we can't see. But until I have evidence to tell you the contrary, that's why I get concerned about this kind of stuff right now.
You mentioned South America. How is the picture looking in Brazil and Argentina as we get set for the bulk of soybean harvest to start?
I'll tell you what, if I was in Mato Grosso, I'd be super happy with the forecast I just released this morning. And the reason for that is the MJO is making this transition that tends to bring in some drier air, and they need drier air in the center west. It's been incredibly wet as of late. And we're starting just to see problems with the soybean. They have to harvest them. They've got to get them out. And they often can't wait. Like, in fall, we can sometimes wait in the Midwest. Like, we just wait. I know we talk unideal, but are not ideal, but they can't because they got to plant a safrinha crop. So I've seen some pretty interesting views of that crop coming out too wet. Southern Brazil is where the drought's been. Argentina is where the drought's been, at least eastern Argentina along the Parana River. And what happened over the weekend? Storms in southern Brazil, storms moved through central Argentina. They didn't end the drought, but it didn't make it last longer. And most of the longer range forecast for the next couple of weeks suggests drier center west, wetter southern Brazil, decent, modest rains. Let's call them modest in Argentina without the major heat coming back on. So the net effect is the same thing I've been telling you now for weeks. I don't have a bullish story coming out of Brazil based upon that. And even though we've seen some problem areas, I think it might be more limited than otherwise thought.
Anything final, Eric, you're watching this week as we close it out?
Yeah. I'd like to know the duration on this cold air and how many more shots of it we've got coming, because one thing has been for sure, this winter has been so mild in Alaska while we've been having so much cold air in this month of January. And Alaska is expected to cool off about 10 days from now. But I want to know if it's going to stick, because if Alaska cools off, man, we'll finally ditch some of this, I'm tired of winter, Jesse. I'm sorry. I shouldn't say that, but I'm like, I'm tired of it. I think I get anxious for hearing thunder again. Like, I don't know. I get kind of like, I get over it and I'm like, all right, bring it back on. Let's talk thunderstorms. And We're not doing that. We're talking about ice. We're talking about probably a huge raid on grocery stores down south to buy every bit of bread and milk that's available, and eggs. Which, by the way, if you're worried about getting stuck in an ice storm, you don't buy that. Buy granola bars, right? That'll you buy the high calorie, non-perishable food. But I was checking too, Jesse, since you brought it up. I always watch Generac stock price ahead of ice storms, especially across the south. And I'm going to go check it when the markets open back up to see if there's been any sort of major movement upward, because when these big events happen, sometimes you get some movement in that area. So all those things are sitting on my mind as we think through this next few weeks.
A lot to watch. I know folks can track it on your website, agweather.com. That's ag-wx.com for more. Eric Snodgrass with Conduit, thanks for joining us. Have a great week. We appreciate the time as always.
Yeah, thanks, Jesse.